All right, hello. Today's lesson is on overloading methods. Before we get to that, I have a warm-up question for you. So pause the video, see if you can make some sense of it before unpausing to watch the answer. And there's something wrong with the code, and how would you fix it? So give it a shot. All right, so the problem with this is the scope of the variable. So specifically the string variable named ask. It actually exists only inside of the parentheses and any sub parentheses. So this ask variable exists only in these if parentheses, and then we have a second ask variable that exists only in the else parentheses. And that's actually okay because their scopes don't cross. But the problem is this, when we do system out print ask here, which is what we want to do, right? We want to print out the ask variable, but it only exists inside of these parentheses, right? Or any sub parentheses. So this is kind of back a level. And so ask doesn't exist. So it's going to give us an error saying there is no ask variable. So what we really want is we want ask to exist inside of this, at least this set of parentheses, or even one level higher if you really wanted. But kind of the way to fix it is to create the variable here and then set it to be either this or this in the if or the else. Okay, so we can still keep that pattern of we set it to be different things based on the if, but we have to declare it, create it up here. So I will show you what that looks. I'll change the code here quick. All right, so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do string ask up here, right? And I'm not going to give it a value at all. I'm just going to create it up there, and then I'm going to give it a value inside of the if and else. So I can take the string part off because I don't have to create it anymore. Okay, and so now what we have is the ask variable has scope from this point down inside of these curly braces. So it'll get created here, so we have access down here outside of the if and else, and then it gets set inside the if else. All right, and again, that's called scope, and you have to make sure that the variable actually has scope in the spot we're using it. All right, so today's lesson is going to be on what's called overloading methods, and it'll make sense at what that is here in a second. But I also want to highlight that I do have another video from the University of Purdue. I'll post this on our website too. It'll be kind of an optional one, but if you want to hear overloading methods in a different voice, you can look here, right? So overloading, like this has obviously got too much stuff. So yeah, that's what we're doing. Okay, so a quick definition for you for an overloaded method is just they're two methods with the same name, but they have different input parameters. Okay, and basically this is allowed. You are allowed to have two methods with the same name with different input parameters, right? That is allowed. Okay, and so an example of this would be, let's say we want to repeat a string, like do it twice, or possibly want to repeat a number, which might just mean to double the number. Okay, so what happens is I can have two public static void repeat methods. All right, so there's two methods called repeat, one that takes in a string and one that takes in a number. Okay, and so the reason we can have two methods named repeat is Java will know which one to use. So when you call a method, you use it, you have to use the name. So I'm calling these methods up here in main, and it knows which method to run, right, because of what is being passed in. So even though there's two methods called repeat, it can distinguish which one. On this first time, it knows it has to run the one with string because the input's a string. And the second time when we input a double, I guess technically this looks like an int, but it would know enough to know that it runs the one that takes in a number here, not the one that takes in a string. So normally you'd have to have a unique name to know which method runs, but you can also get away with this because Java's smart enough to also know based on what the input is, what the input type is. All right, so basically what we're going to talk about is like the method signature. So the signature is a name along with the input parameters. And that's kind of how you distinguish how the method gets called. So that's called the signature, is the name and the input parameters. All right. So basically, you have to have a unique method signature. So here's some specific notes on it. The signature refers to the name of the method along with the inputs. Okay, so our main method is called main, and then its signature also includes this string, which we'll talk about this later. This is actually an array. So we've done a single string, but this bracket means just an array of strings, which we'll hit in chapter 6. And you have to have unique signature. All right, and so if we look here, what overloading means is we could do another method called main and get away with it because this main has a different signature than the main up here. All right, and then the reason again is this has different input parameters. Instead of this string bracket with an array of strings, this one takes in 2 ints. And again, if I was to call, let's say I want to use a method, if I call main 7.5, it's going to know to run the one down here because it takes an int, not string. All right, so it knows which one to use. So this would call the one down here. All right, and please note that the return type is not part of the signature. Okay, so that's not a way to differentiate between methods is the return type. It's just the input parameters. The return type is not part of the signature. Okay, so my question is, these are methods all called validate, right? So that's the idea of overloading is method with the same name. So I have 4 validate method names. All right, we're validating some input to make sure it's accurate or whatever. And so I want to know what are the signatures of each of these, and then which two would create the error, right? Which two would create a problem where they wouldn't have unique signatures. All right, so go ahead, pause the video and see if what I've been saying makes any sense at all. Okay, so the signature is, again, just the name along with the input parameters. So this one has validate and int, a single int as a signature. This one has validate with 2 ints. So these two are okay because they have different input parameters. The third one is validate, and the signature is validate with a string s, which is still okay because it's different than what we have. All right, and then the last one is validate with 2 ints, and that's going to conflict with number 2. All right, because they have the same signature. Their signature is validate with 2 ints, right? So those two both would conflict and couldn't be in the same program together because they would create an error, right? And kind of again the reason would be is if I was to call validate and pass in 6 and 5, right? It wouldn't know which one to run, number 2 or number 4. All right, so it would fail. Okay, notice that these two do have different return types, but that's not enough to distinguish the method. If I call this, Java's not going to know which validate to run. It doesn't matter the return type. That doesn't help us. That's not part of the signature, right? So basically, a signature, again, is just the name along with the inputs, and you can't have 2 methods named validate that both take in a pair of ints. That would create a problem in Java. So you'd have to eliminate one of them essentially, or change the name or something like that. Otherwise, it won't work. Okay, one more question to see if this made any sense to you. So there's a lot of right answers to these, but here's a couple methods that say they're inside of a program or whatever, and I want to overload them. All right, so what would be a correct way to overload the method? So think about what that means, see if it's made any sense, and just write the heading. You don't have to write the full method, just a heading that would be an example of overloading the method. So pause the video and give this a shot. This will be a good test to see if what I'm saying has made much sense. Okay, so for the first one, all I need to do is to overload is use a method with the same name, but the idea is, again, I can't have the same inputs. Okay, so maybe I want to make one that tests a double or something like that. So to overload it, I could do a public static int. We could make it int again, but I'm going to test. and this time I'm going to test a double input. Okay, so that would be an example of overloading because it has the same name but a different input. Right? Instead of being a string, we have a double as our input, so that would count as overloading. And again, you could have done anything, just call it test, and then have a different inputs here, and then it would be considered overloaded. All right, same thing down here, right? So I'm going to make another method called find max if I'm overloading it, and then I'm going to change the input. So maybe I want to find the max of 3 things instead of 2. So I could do public static double. Again, the return type doesn't matter. I could even make it void. It doesn't really make any difference when you're overloading. But I'm going to do find max double input 1, input 2, and input 3. Okay, and that would not create an error again because the signature is different. It's called find max, but one takes in 2 doubles and one takes in 3. So that's considered a different method, essentially. It has a different signature. Right? And again, there would have been tons of right answers here. You just would have had to do find max and then a different set of inputs, and that would count as being overloaded. Okay, so final thing I want to do with you is I want to go back to our palindrome program. All right, and again, if you remember what a palindrome is, it's a word that's spelled the same forwards and backwards. And so I'm just going to talk about how we could overload. Like this is my example of where you might want to overload a method because I feel like it's kind of abstract. I'm trying to make it as concrete as possible by giving you an example of where it would make real sense to overload the method. Okay, so I'm going to load this up here, and you don't really have to do anything here except if you wanted to go back and mess with your palindrome program, you could, but more or less you can just kind of watch through this with me and see if it makes sense. Okay, so basically, I have one that does, takes a string like taco cat and then tests if that's a palindrome, right? And that is palindrome, returns true or false if it is a palindrome or not. Okay, so here's the method, takes in a string and returns a Boolean, right? And actually, this is kind of a good example since we're talking about methods. I don't think we did a method before when we did this, but basically this is a really good example of where you could use methods because inside of my palindrome method, I could also have another one that reverses it, right? So basically I could have a little string method that reverses the strings, takes in a string, returns a reverse string. So that my isPalindrome method could say, hey, just reverse the word, check if the reverse is equal to the original, and then return true or false. Okay, so anyways, that's the kind of the code we had already, except it's modified a little bit to use methods. All right, so what I want to do though is I want to test is the number of palindrome. Right, so I want to call isPalindrome, get a Boolean true or false, but I want to pass in a number. Okay, so the idea is, I'm going to make another isPalindrome method, but I'm just going to overload it. Okay, so what I mean by that is I'm going to take this signature, I'm going to copy it. All right, and then instead of taking in a string here, I'm going to take in a double, and I'm going to take in number. All right, so the question is, that's an example of overloading, right? Because now I have a number. But I wanted to show you a trick here that's pretty cool example of overloading. So the idea is actually, if I want to test a number, maybe I should make this an int actually, because the double might have a 0.0 on the end, and that would mess up the palindrome thing. So like something like that should be a palindrome. 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. That should be a palindrome. Okay, so a real cool trick is you can actually use the isPalindrome method that uses a string, because I can just basically do string and then take my number and turn it into a string. And a good trick for that is if you just do double quote plus number, that'll turn the number into a string. And then I can just return whatever is returned by my other isPalindrome method. Okay, so this is a pretty cool trick where I can make an isPalindrome for a number, and all I do is turn it into a string and use my string isPalindrome method. So I thought that was kind of a cool example where you could overload it to handle numbers pretty easily by using the existing method. Okay, and you can see that this one should return true because it is a palindrome. right? So that's called